just a little bit, I believe, about the research that NCIC is doing with a little bit of a focus on antifungals. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Kirsty. So, hi everyone. I'm going to just give you a little bit of a brief background on our Centre of Research Excellence, under which this antifungal grant sits, which Kaz will be talking about in more detail. So antifungal stewardship is obviously a big interest for us. And unfortunately, I can't stay till the end of the meeting because I've just been asked to give some comments on Candida auris. You might have seen the New York Times article over the weekend about Candida auris. So it seems like it's initiated a storm of interest. So I think I'll have to talk to the ABC, which will be fun after this. So talking about the National Centre for Infections in Cancer, this is our logo. And actually, I never realised so much thought goes into a logo. It actually is meant to represent the three arms that we have in this Centre of Research Excellence: surveillance, implementation, and innovations. And my little kind of thought processes on the side are really how these all feed into each other. Obviously, the surveillance that you do impacts on refinements of care. Refinements of care are impacted by innovations, and of course, implementation is crucial because it doesn't matter how much good things you discover or improve, if you can't implement them and disseminate them, there's not much point. So this is really the kind of underlying theme for the National Centre for Infections in Cancer. And obviously, I just need to go forwards. Just trying to move forwards here. No? Do I have to use the mouse? Back and forwards, okay, thank you. So, really, the idea for this came out of the unmet needs in cancer. We know that at any one time in our wards, 60% of cancer patients are on antibiotics. And we also know that when we look at national strategy plans for cancer all around the country, nothing is mentioned about infection, which is a glaring oversight when you think of how big infection is in the lives and in the outcomes of these patients. We also know that the models of care that we use to define how we treat cancer patients really haven't changed. And I think we're really behind the eight ball when we look at our colleagues, for example, in haematology, how much advance has come in the last 40 years with genetic testing of cancers, with immunotherapies, etc. And we're still banging on about febrile neutropenia and when do we start antibiotics, etc. So we really haven't progressed a huge amount over the last 40 years. And we could be doing much more innovation and perhaps using some of the lessons learned in immunotherapy, in metagenomics, to be looking at how we actually better treat and risk define our cancer patients. So this program is a health services research program, which means that it actually is about how we improve and deliver care, but it does have discovery and models of care and health economics and consumer feedback as part of the centre. So currently we have 9 PhDs, 4 postdocs and 1 nurse practitioner in training. And the nurse practitioner role is very interesting because they can actually help identify patients that we need to consult on, help look at antibiotic allergies, etc. So we've found this role to be a very useful and a role currently in development. So who do we collaborate with? We have some international collaborations. National, Gab Heusler has done a study looking at paediatric febrile neutropenia, and this has encompassed 8 paediatric cancer centres around Australia. We also, of course, have close collaborations in the precinct with all of you, with the Doherty and with other research institutes around Australia. The other area that's sort of taking a lot of attention at the moment is the infections in the immunocompromised host meeting. That will be being held in Melbourne in June 2020, and I think it's a great forum for us to really showcase the great work that's being done in Australia in terms of infections in cancer, antimicrobial resistance, infection prevention, etc. So this meeting is currently being planned, and the last meeting I've just put up a volume here, which was a publication that came from the last infections in immunocompromised host meeting, which was focused around fungal infections. I'll be hoping to do a similar publication for the Melbourne meeting. The current research, the three streams are the surveillance stream, that's led by Leon Worth, the implementation stream led by Thursky, and innovation led by me. And I guess I've just highlighted these pink boxes is what Kaz will be talking about in a bit more detail, looking at IT platforms to inform surveillance, looking at real-time fungal management and electronic systems to aid management of antifungal prescribing, and looking at machine learning. And we've done a little bit of work with machine learning, looking at scanning and natural language processing of CT scan reports to try and identify early fungal infections. And so that will be some work being built into the stewardship area. In terms of projects, I think just to give you a quick rundown, and this is almost my last slide, really focuses on the projects that have been completed. There's been I mentioned the febrile neutropenia in paediatrics. There's been a outpatient therapy for febrile neutropenia, low-risk febrile neutropenia. That project is run by Ben and Gab Hausler. And then there are a number of projects still underway, allergy delabelling, the PIPIN study, which is a randomised study comparing CT with PET-CT for patients with prolonged febrile neutropenia in haematology and stem cell transplant. There's some CMV work, particularly looking at the CMV quantiferon test to predict recurrent CMV infections and risk for CMV in the allo transplant, and that's led by Michelle Yong. Jake Valentine is doing a PhD looking at big data for surveillance, so trying to capture some of the big data that the hospitals automatically kind of collect and use that to look at infection trends and informing risk groups for infection. There's biomarkers work which is done by Bente and Mark Pellegrini, looking at trying to predict risks for infections in patients who have actually had a heavy exposure to chemotherapy or immunotherapy, and trying to look at their immune responses and see whether that is going to predict their risk for infection down the track. Because with a lot of these therapies, one upon the other through a patient's course of treatment, it's often very hard to tease out what their current risk for infection is, particularly when they've had agents that attack multiple arms of the immune system. Health economics is Michelle Chu, who's looking at the health economics of the sepsis pathway, among other things. Antimicrobial stewardship in paediatrics, Brendan McMullen, working in Sydney. And infection prophylaxis in stem cell transplant, Julian Lindsay, again working in Sydney and doing PhDs through the University of Melbourne. So there'll be some news projects starting this year. We'll be expanding to do some work in the microbiome, some PKPD, prophylaxis agents, and vaccinations after stem cell transplant. Just wanted to quickly touch on a couple of grants and fellowships that have happened over the year. There's been certainly some grants achieved, like a VCA Early Career Fellowship and some other charitable foundations and industry investigator fellowships received, as well as Michelle Yong and her Early Career Fellowship. And some prizes and awards. I think it's always good to actually look at this as a marker of how we're tracking. And certainly these projects have been successful in attracting awards as well. So I might conclude there by saying that the NCIC is a centre. It's based at Peter Mac, but it really incorporates a lot of centres within this precinct and within Australia. We're looking to develop models of care that are going to be adopted nationally. We have some national and international collaborations established and links to international cancer centres, and obviously our vision is to improve the outcome of patients with cancer, recognising that infection is a big problem for cancer patients and often is a cause of death in people being treated for cancer. So I might stop there. Kaz is going to talk in specific about the fungal stewardship grant, but we'd like to, obviously if anybody has any questions or comments, happy to address that before Kaz starts to present. Kaz, over to you.
Thanks very much, Arden. This was a quote that I put at the very top of my project grant application, which I'm going to do in every grant application now, because particularly right at this minute with the candidate wars reaching the public, I think it was actually very relevant. This grant actually is really an add-on to MCAS that's been the funding is through the Department of Medicine. But obviously it's a very close collaboration between our two teams, and it really was an ideal opportunity to bring together Vids, Guidance, Peter Mac, Royal Melbourne, Children's, Austin, to work together on this project. And so I hope it will intersect with a lot of you with what you're seeing. So this is our team. Some of those names you will recognise, some you won't. CIC, Karin, verse 4, is one of the heads of the School of Software Engineering and is already very much involved in VCCC in terms of using big data. She is very knowledgeable in using big data, natural language processing, and is going to be a key person, particularly in this precinct. And clearly, with the EPIC coming, it will pose additional new challenges about how we get data out to actually do some of this work. The associate investigators really to represent epidemiologists, paediatricians, hematologists, Doug Boyle is from the university. He oversees the Granite software, which is the software that's used to pull out data from GP systems for medicine, MPS medicine-wise. And that system is actually also being used in hospitals to extract data for clinical epidemiology study. Eddie Lau is a nuclear medicine physician who went with Peter Mac to Austin. Kim Dalziel is already working with us to co-supervise Michelle Chu, our health economic PhD, and having a health economist on these health services research projects is really important. Louise is involved in setting up the PGP registry. Simon Harrison, one of the hematologists, Dave Ritchie, and Stephen Holmes, who you all well know from RMH. Because it was important that we had a radiologist investigator on the ground because of the opportunity for natural language processing of radiology reports. So just before I go into the talk, in health services research, in terms of implementing and creating change, we often break down what we do in these three core elements. So what are the structural measures, the context, what are the things we need to have in place to do what we want to do, what sort of staff do we need, what sort of tools do we need. Process measures are examining how well we do what we do. In stewardship, we definitely look at it from both a quantitative point of view, is how much we're prescribing, quality is how well we are prescribing, what is our compliance, what is our appropriateness, and then of course outcome measures, because we need to measure the unintended consequences and the intended consequences of what we're actually doing. So this is very important, and it's a general philosophy around how we approach most things in stewardship actually. So this is the outline of the grant, the overview. So just looking at what we are aiming to do as part of the grant. The first is to establish process measures, because at the moment we don't actually have a case definition for invasive fungal infection. All we have is a very complicated definition I'll show you shortly, which was designed for enrolling patients into clinical trials for fungal infections rather than something that is a useful case definition on a day-to-day basis. We don't have process measures. We don't have the metrics for how we measure quality or even quantity of antifungal prescribing. It is far behind antibiotics. And what are the patient outcome measures that we'll be looking at? And then I'll step through what we'll be doing. Karin Advantage is in the room down the back, who's currently doing a PhD with Monica, myself, Paul Johnson, David Kong. And it was very fortuitous when we put this grant together, because Karin was not only instrumental in writing the application, but a lot of the literature review that went into the application and some of the pieces of work that are being done as part of the application actually fitted very well with her PhD. So extremely fortunate to have Karin with us. The second element is how can we develop, using our experience with the NAPS platform, how we can actually develop a meaningful deep dive and prevalence survey audit tool for antifungals with their own individual issues, particularly around patient risk. And can we use data from our day-to-day healthcare to actually support an automated surveillance? We don't know if we can, but that is the aim. And so part of that would be to develop a NAPS tool. We know our NAPS users want to have deep dive audits. They want to be able to audit their AMLs and how well they're compliant with the prophylaxis guidelines, if they want to know what their breakthrough rates are. These are the sort of things that are generally done in a piecemeal fashion, almost always with research funding. So every publication that we've ever done around antifungal use and audit in the precinct here has always been on the back of a registrar project or other project. It's never been able to be sort of put into day-to-day work, because I'll step through the complications, the difficulties of doing that. And then finally, trying to establish how we get some benchmarking IFR rates in high risk groups. And we've actually specifically kept to the high risk population, which I'll show in a second. So Karin is going to be presenting a poster. That's a poster number, should be elected. So those of you at ECMID, go and visit Karin's work. But we did a 20-question survey to hospitals that looked after high-risk patients, both solid transplants, hematology and stem cell transplant units, to try and understand what they're actually doing in the space of monitoring their invasive fungal infections and antifungal stewardship. What were the costs? What's the dollars that they spend on antifungals? So it was really very interesting. And you can see that although about a third of them were principal referrals, there are other public acute care and private hospitals that are actually looking at these high-risk patients. Additionally, this is very important. This has been borne out in some of the work that Kirsty and Jacqueline Bishop are doing. There are really complicated patients being managed outside of metropolitan cities. How do we know what the quality of care is for those patients, and what do we need to do? And then there were, good example, good spread of oncology, hematology. Quarter of the hospitals had allogeneic or looked after allogeneic stem cell transplants and solid organ transplants. So if we look at what they're kind of doing, this is days of therapy. Those of you who know days of therapy in terms of measuring, this really requires using electronic prescribing records. It's not something that can be done through pharmacy dispensing. Generally, what's done through pharmacy dispensing is extracting data out of the Melbourne and other pharmacy dispensing systems, converting those to defined daily dosing, adjusting by bed days. Many sites had said that they had done a detailed clinical audit on something in the previous 2 years. I think that didn't we count 2 years? Usually by quantity. Of course, most of our primary, larger acute care and principal referrals participate in the point prevalence survey. The trouble is with point prevalence surveys, it's a point in time. And those of you who understand fungal infections, patients go on a long journey. They go on a long journey from having prophylaxis to having empiric therapy to having directed therapy and secondary prophylaxis. and you never get a true picture of how appropriate that patient is managed all the way along. So, for example, we see a lot of patients who are treated with an invasive fungal infection and then are on weeks and weeks and weeks and months and months and months of azoles, where they probably could potentially have stopped a long time earlier, or just starting to outpatient instead of prophylaxis. And of course, cost, not surprising, was very, very common. When we looked at barriers to AFS, it was interesting, and I think the same could be said of here. While we're sort of accepted and very comfortable with doing AFS, antimicrobial steward in the general hospital, it falls down a little bit in a complex patient group like the haematology or stem cell transplant group. And that is because assessing antifungal appropriate at a particular point in time for a patient really requires that the team understand the complexity and risk of that patient. And you need to be around those patients, I think, to have a good feeling sometimes, because I can tell you that haematologists are very invested in their patients, and they can have a very robust discussion why they think that patient is high risk. No, we're going to keep them going because they're going to go to stem cell transplant, blah, blah, blah. And it's very hard for a general ID physician in that position to say no. A, because the mortality of an untreated fungal infection in stem cell transplant is really a death sentence. So, and that has meant that over the years that we really haven't built up what's required, possibly from the EFT, possibly because of tools that we use. There's obviously prioritisation into the burden, the large burden of antibiotic use in the general hospital. There's often, it's limited by lack of access to fungal diagnostics and therapeutic drug monitoring. That's a serious issue, hopefully soon to be rectified in our precinct. And lack of IT support, lack of leadership in their own hospitals, lack of expertise, and then, of course, there is very little evidence, which is what we're trying to build. So if we look at antifungal costs, I think this is really telling. So if we're looking at the principal referral hospitals now, these are the ones that do the stem cell transplants and solid organ transplants. You know, the median is $500,000 to $1 million. But look, there are some outliers here that are spending millions on antifungals, and even in the other hospitals, it's still you know, while it's less than 500,000, these are big budget cost items, and often we're asked to address them without really knowing what we're supposed to be doing. I just pulled this table from the grant application just to give you an idea of just how many leukemia cases there are. This was from the AHW website, so almost 4,000 cases of leukemia in 2017. These were mission induction, patients relapsed are very high risk, ALLs are very high risk. We don't actually have a clearly evidence-based strategy on how to give these patients antifungal prophylaxis, even though we know that the risk is up to 25% in some centres. And quite high rates of invasive fungal infections, again, with quite high rates, so even with the attributable mortality. Stem cell transplants are continuing to increase, and indications are continuing to progress each year. 2016 figures, there were 700 in Australia. Again, we know that there are particular high-risk groups and that they are reasonably high rates of invasive fungal infection. And this patient group have a very high mortality of those infections. And then solid organ transplants. In this particular grant, we hope to do a little bit of a spotlight on the liver transplant population at the Austin, which is a specific group that have some interesting issues, particularly related to invasive Candida infections, which is very relevant at the moment. So we don't have a standardised approach on how to understand the rate of infections without doing it in a very defined project way. When we look at antimicrobial stewardship, it's the same principles, but antifungal stewardship poses its own problems when we're looking at success of our interventions. So while we want to promote judicious use, look at optimal patient outcomes and conserve our drugs, we only really have sort of 4 well-established classes of antifungals. We're running a trial on on a new drug F2G at the moment, which we're using on a Lamentis flora patient, but really they're very slow in coming. We have major issues in looking at our outcomes because this is so difficult. Optimising this is difficult, especially when you don't have experts on site or the diagnostic support and non-culture-based testing. That's really hard to monitor the outcomes of the program. And you may or may not be aware that with the Metro Tunnel Bill, we managed to get a little bit of funding to try and address this issue in the precinct by looking at what's been happening in terms of rates of invasive fungal infection. Cheyenne's in the room, so she's the project person for that, to see whether there has been any impact on rates of invasive fungal infections. It's very hard to know whether things are nosocomial or community-acquired as well. And obviously the new kid on the block is how to do we monitor resistance. It's not traditionally been an issue with Canada, although Victoria has very high rates of laboratory and more resistant candidates, say, than New South Wales in the previous Australian Candidemia studies. And then, of course, we're the lucky precinct that have had a couple of the auruses. So I think it's really important. So this is this diagnostic criteria that I was telling you about before. It's actually multifactorial, classifying patients as prudent, probable, or possible. And possible are really a common group for us because these are patients who are high risk that have something that might suggest it. And probable is commonly a high-risk host with changes on radiology, and often they do not have other mycological criteria, particularly they don't get to barrier. So it's a multifactorial algorithmic type of diagnostic criteria that unless you're used to using it and using it in clinical studies, you wouldn't be using this on a day-to-day basis. So first came off the rank is to develop the surveillance definition. And actually we have a very large data, we have a huge data set of patients from a dozen of our previous studies that have been performed over the last 15, 20 years really. So one of the studies that I had my two children in the middle of was really looking at the breakthrough rates of IFI as fluconazole, itraconazole, voriconazole, etc. We have a large data set from the children's as well. And really we're going to look at how, and that every IFI episode confirmed or excluded was measured against the gold standard definition. And so we will be able to look at the performance of various combinations of clinical data, radiology, and fungal use, microbiology, non-culture-based tests to look to see how predictive they are, and can we actually develop a simplified clinical surveillance definition that could be used on a day-to-day basis in the hospital. The second piece of work is trying to identify patients at risk, and how can we best do that? Well, we can actually use administrative data, hospital coding data, and Jake Valentine's in the back, who is actually doing some very interesting work aligning how well serious infections like staph bacteremia, C. diff and fungal infections coded in administrative data compared to actual gold standard definitions from studies or programs within the hospitals. And that piece of alignment is particularly important as we're interested in the HAC funding statewide. And then many of the hospitals do have quite comprehensive clinical data repositories and registries, particularly, for example, biomarker registries. So Leon's going to be working on that process, and we're also working with a Swinburne technology with a new PhD that's starting to see whether we can build an ontology around diagnosis of fungal infections, which can be used later on down the track from the clinic machine classifiers and surveillance. Karin, Abby and Gabe are going to be leading an international Delphi survey. For those of you who are not familiar with the Delphi survey, it's really putting together a series of statements around anything that you want a decision on. Gab has previously done a international Delphi survey on trying to come up with a definition of neutropenic fever and elements around neutropenic fever in children that would support clinical research. So standardising the definition, standardising what sort of data should be collected, definition of sepsis, etc., etc. Interestingly, in that Delphi, they couldn't agree on a definition for neutropenic fever in children. but they agreed on a lot of other things. So this Delphi is going to be really looked at metrics around what would be considered minimum standards for measuring quantity and both quality of antifungal use, and also outcome measures. It is no longer appropriate just to manage antifungal costs without considering the appropriateness of the use. So, indication, which at-risk group, guideline concordance, understanding work epidemiology, what is your baseline rate to inform your antifungal prophylaxis strategy, I think is really important. And then to understand, well, what definition are we going to use for outcomes, because we can't continue, we think it's not feasible to continue to use the erotic definitions, which are going to be updated soon. Again, aren't they, Monica, including Aspergillus PCR as the definition. So when we think of it back to those process measures, they've got quantity as well as quality. So antibiotic consumption is really difficult to work with this data, and again, for those familiar with the Norse data that comes from South Australia, there are some really significant limitations. You can't use that data for paediatrics. It doesn't account for case mix or complex patients, or whether there's been dosing strategy changes over the years. Days of therapy is recommended by IDSA, but then they have very high penetration of EMR and EMNs, where they can actually collect that data automatically. It's not very easy to be done. And of course, these metrics must be adjusted for the population. So looking at the defined daily doses as classified by WHO, the OTC index, you can see that these are the defined daily doses of many of these drugs, many of which we do use much bigger doses. And it will not be representative of what we're actually currently usually prescribing for our patients. And there's no defined daily dose of lambda-tyrosine, and these are perhaps less controversial. And we do know that particularly in this situation, we have very complex patients which would reflect high usage. There are some alternative metrics that have been proposed, particularly by the German group, looking at recommended or prescribed daily doses, which could then be mapped back to the clinical guidelines for that particular indication, and also days of antifungal therapy or days of systemic antifungal therapy as some other metrics that could be proposed. In terms of quality measures, these probably look familiar to you in terms of what we measure in NAPS, and we think that pretty much everything in NAPS is highly relevant. The only thing is with antifungals, we need to be clear around, so that's duplicated there, but we need to be clear about the indication for which the antifungal is used, and the patient does step through various phases of using those fungal infection, whether it's possible, probably proven, whether it's empiric, directed or prophylaxis. We have some additional opportunities here to look at the role of TDM, particularly toxicity and drug interactions. So with these new agents like venetoclax, in terms of reducing venetoclax dose or avoiding azoles for complex patients. Nearly all of our haematology high-risk patients are actually in clinical trials, and there's often quite strict recommendations as to but many of them can't have azoles, which brings into place things like intermittent dosing of andazone. And these have led to huge costs transferred across the precinct, much to the annoyance of both sides, I think. This is just to show you, this is a NAPS data from 2017, but just to point out a couple of things. So here we have compliance with therapeutic guidelines and compliance with locally endorsed guidelines. With antifungals, it's much more likely that there has been a local guideline that they have locally endorsed for how they might use antifungals in their own precinct. We don't know the quality of this, where this is what they have measured against themselves as they're doing in NAPS. So here, I think that's an interesting point. This also came out very strongly with the paediatric NAPS, often using their own guidelines, like therapeutic guidelines. And then the second part is appropriateness, where NAPS appropriateness for antifungals is actually done quite well, actually much higher than for standard antibiotics. And I think that is because a lot of the prescribing is probably partly overseen by some experts, they're principal referral hospitals where they've already got sort of strong, robust policies and procedures in place. So what will we do with the maps? Well, we'll follow the very same methodology. Our team will be integrally involved. We'll have funding for additional staff in the MAPS team. And we will use the core metrics that we've identified in Aim 1. We do want to be able to do deep dive audits to give meaningful information about either drugs or diseases, as well as the point prevalence surveys. We do follow a very standard methodology where we look at trialling out the surveys in a paper-based audit with using our expert stewardship pharmacists and ID physician colleagues. We look at usability, feasibility, then we move from the case report to the electronic tool, then we carefully pilot that, and then we do user-based surveys, either electronic surveys or semi-structured interviews, and we go through a stepwise process until we're happy with the tool. And that's a method we're following for MAPS in each of its modules now. So outcome measures are really important because I think we need to understand whether we're improving patient outcomes or causing unintended consequences. That includes costs, unfortunately. Our drivers are often costs in our hospitals, and we need to use it as a balancing measure. And the outcome measures, we can look clinical, financial, and microbiological. So clinical breakthrough rates, what are the mortalities? Again, always small numbers. So often all of our clinical trials are compounded by the fact that the actual events themselves are not very common. And mortality, again, so quite small numbers here. I think treatment-related toxicity is actually really important and a real issue. Financial cost effectiveness. So cost effective is much, much more than looking at just costing or patient outcomes. It's actually costing the whole program to deliver the antifungal stewardship program and the drugs and the staff, looking at outcomes, and then long-term mortality of patients. So to do a full sort of cost effectiveness study is actually quite complex, and why we have got that as one of our streams in NCRC. And then, of course, microbiological, which everyone wants to know, the IFI rates. So this is, surveillance is a real challenge because patient risk changes over time. So we know that a standard AML patient gets through with quite a low risk of invasive fungal infection, be it they have relapse disease and high-risk disease. They do definitely they are definitely a much higher risk, and each year or two we see changes in strategy in the regimens used to treat them. And so often there'll be a new drug on the block. Venetoclax, for example, is an excellent example where suddenly we saw a whole lot of issues relating to the use azoles in this patient group. We often do clinically diagnose them without positive microbiology. And so so you can't just use laboratory-based surveillance like in bacteremia surveillance, for example. And that radiological finding, when we did the natural language processing study across Peter, Royal Melbourne and the Alfred, the reports that the Alfred were sort of 230 words long, the reports at Royal Melbourne were 500 words long, and the reports at Peter were like 1,000 words long. So when we actually had to annotate those reports to develop the machine classifier, that was thousands of hours of work that we did. So again, building classifiers over text reports is really complex and difficult too. The other issue we commonly face is when is a yeast or a mould a coloniser and not invasive. You will well be aware about use of PET scans, and in fact, Abby is here, is doing the first ever randomised control trial of PET CT versus routine HRCT, specifically for that question, because one of the outcomes of that study is to see whether it actually has reduced the empiric use of systemic antifungals and whether we can actually drive a business case for PETs for infection for an MBS item number. So again, bringing that health economic input. And then finally, the documentation of clinical history. So over the years, Alan will have remembered all this, our long time, shockingly resource-intensive audits. So Cheyenne's probably groaning and Abby's groaning. Having to look at these cases are huge. It takes hours to do a full assessment of IFIs in patients. We can use various data sources. They're very, very large data sets, and it's usually done retrospectively because it's just not feasible to use our current data prospectively. And coding data in the past anyway has missed it, so Invasive to look at that. So that's one of Jake's core questions. This was the Australian Candidemia study. They only captured candidemia if it was actually on the front page of the discharge summary. So it brings back that importance of making sure that important things are on the front page of the discharge summary. And Jake's mentioned Jake already. So we have potentially the kind of data sources really from our hospital systems, microheme, biochem, molecular micro. It looks like Aspergillus PCR is going to be up and running fairly soon, maybe by June at Royal Melbourne in the lab. Deb Williams is very keen to be able to offer some of these more rapid turnaround of these non-culture-based tests. Obviously, things like antimicrobial approvals are very, very important. And in fact, Brendan MacCallum published a whole paper on how he used guidance approvals at the Sydney Children's, which was far more effective than using the coding data and other data sources to identify patients with fungal infections. So again, reinforcing the importance of our mandatory approvals for these drugs and capturing the indication properly. This was an example of a study that Jazz King did when she was our fellow at Peter Mac. There has actually been very little, in fact this is one of the few studies of invasive fungal infections in non-AML patients. So the breakthrough rate in AML patients is around about 2 to 7%. But we did not know what sort of rates there were non-AML. But it's more to show you the type of data that we use. We did try and use electronically available data. So we combined pharmacy data, our consult data, the charm chemotherapy data to understand how many cycles of chemo that they had to try and identify risk and guidance approvals. To use all that data together to try and come up with some figures. I mean, they're very much ballpark figures, but it really was quite interesting to see that we knew this group was at risk because of some of the neuroagents, and this is an ALL group, very high rates of invasive fungal infection. But we saw this in diffuse large B-cell lymphomas, which are actually another group of reasonably high risk. So this is the last slide, I think, but really what are we going to do? Well, we want to use routinely available health data to extract that data and work with our software engineering colleagues and our team to identify a methodology that we can clinically validate on the ground with real cases, with ID physicians and stewardship pharmacists on the ground to establish a methodology for automated real-time surveillance, and then down the track towards the end of the graph, if that is actually working, we will build a clinical interface. And this piece of work is going to be very strongly driven with the guidance team. And that's just a timeline of what we're doing. So we're kicking off shortly with the Delphi survey. We've employed we're actually applying, we've got an ad out for a project officer for their group for the whole project. Karin obviously will be very integral to our project. Looking at hospital interfaces, we probably need to be working behind EPIC. You're getting data from the legacy source databases and EPIC. Obviously EPIC's not going to be up and running after 2020, but you need to be aware that the quality of data that can come out of EPIC to support our research is still questionable, and if anyone is interested, they need to be involved in the EMR research working party, because at the moment it's the one that I've attended it's not hugely positive news in terms of the sort of data that they can get out actually. So it's really fun. So that's my last slide, just to let you know the timeline. That's it.